Okay, this is a little tip trick video I wanted to record briefly to what to use or what to do when you're using maps that you found online when it comes to displacement and normals. So this is an example from a student, and so we were taking a look at her project, and her normals were looking. There's two issues with them. One, her normal height surface information was a little too strong, and two, something we're not seeing here is that when we enable displacement, the whole surface starts to really inflate a lot. And this is more obvious when we enable, let's come back out here, all the other pieces, right? You can see the whole surface is inflating through the other pieces. And so that's two separate issues, but we'll take a look at them in a second. So the first issue for the height, I'm going to disable displacement for a bit. Is the main issue is that for this looking so crunchy and dark and shadowy and artifacty, is that here I have this right here. This is where I'm loading this in. Actually, this isn't the worst. It looks more like this, right? And you're seeing this like almost like weird black shadowing effect. The reason is what she's doing, or what she was originally doing, was she was loading in both a height and a normal map. And so they're kind of doing the same thing. They don't have the same information, obviously. So, you know, like the normal map usually has like a lot more information in it. And then the height is usually has like bigger, higher frequency information. So normal maps usually have like higher frequency, and height maps usually have lower frequency. You get like more big like surface undulation from a height map, and variation in a normal map. You're going to get more like sharp detail information. But it's kind of up to you depending on how you want to use that information, right? You can use both of them, but you gotta be careful because they tend to like double up on the same information in terms of how you shade this right here. What we could do is we can just dial these in, right? So I can just let's go to the normals here, and one of the easiest ways to just dial in the opacity on these. So let's go ahead and start with the height channel. All right, so I'll just come in here and I'll just get this with big surface information, and then we can come in here with the normal map, and then we can just go ahead and push that a little bit more so get some sharper details. So, you know, it tends to be best to dial this in and not just rely on the map to give you what you want, right? Because otherwise it's going to be just too much information. So let's go to height, and maybe we can push that just a little bit more. And it's starting to get a little artifacty, but it's working pretty good. So that's one way we could do it. Another way is I sometimes if you know the height map is doing almost the same amount of work as the normal map, and I don't really need the normal map, I might just use the height map. The reason why I might just use the height map is because the nice thing about a height map is it can translate into the displacement. So whenever I enable displacement, I can get that information in there too. Okay, cool. So that's that, right? So I'm either using just the height and not the normal, or if I'm using both of them, I'm dialing them in separately, just using the different opacities, so that I can, you know, really fine tune the detail, and so it's not too intense and not too strange, right? Okay, so the other issue is the inflation issue. So let's go ahead. I'm going to disable that, and you know, a lot of times what you guys will do is, you know what, I'll just have to dial the value down, which a lot of times actually works. It's totally legit. But what we're not realizing is that we're not using the displacement information correctly according to height. So we are working with the height channel. The problem, and I'll just set this all the way up to 100. So I'm using this displacement node right here, right? The problem is we're using a displacement map that was exported out to be used as usually as like a JPEG or a PNG for a displacement shader. But that's not how the height shader works. The way that the height shader works, let me go ahead and pause this really quickly. I'll come up with an example. Okay, here's an example. So in our texture maps, you know, we're working with values from 0 to 1, or 0 to 255, but they're remapped to 0 to 1. So in a texture map, you know, we go from black to white, right? Like we can only have 0 to 1 in terms of our pixel values. They can go 0 to 55, and you know, if you have a different storage map like a 16-bit TIFF or something like that, you can have different values. But generally when we're working with JPEGs and PNGs and most images, it's clamped from 0 to 1. Those are what the values we can represent are. So when we have a displacement map, the displacement map has that value from 0 to 1. It goes from black to white. Those are the values we have. And so for displacement maps, these are going to be, the information in here inside the displacement map is going to be representing the surface going up and the surface going down. And so what's helpful, or what we need to do, or what the map needs to do, is it needs to define when the surface is not moving, right? How does the surface know when it's supposed to go up and down versus when it should be just sitting still? And so what we do is we define a mid value. So a mid value, whatever this value is, you can also think of it, some people call it sea level, right? It's like where the surface isn't going to change at all. It's not going to move up and down. So on displacement map, a lot of times that's going to be the 50% gray value. So that mid value is going to say, don't move the surface. And then anything that's darker than 50% gray is going to push the surface down like this. Anything that's brighter than that 50% gray is going to push the surface up. And whenever you set up with a RenderMan shader and you're doing like a texture map and you plug it into a displacement transform node and you plug it into displacement, if you set it to centered and you set that value to 5, it's going to know that. It's going to know 50% gray, 0.5, is the center. So that's just how we're centering those JPEG PNG displacement maps, especially the ones that are coming from Substance Painter. Now, a height channel on the other end, height channel, it's going from 1 to -1, and actually I think it probably goes further than 1 and -1, but it's going from positive to negative instead of from 0 to 1. So I'm going to hide this for a second, and so the the mid value is actually going to be black or 0. So when we have this mid value right here, 0 or black or nothing is essentially going to be the surface staying still. So then the surface when it's black is going to be sitting still. Anything larger than black or greater than black is going to go up. Anything in the negative is going to go down. So anything that's positive is going to go up, and anything that's negative is going to go down. So that's the difference between the displacement map or a texture map and then Substance's height channel. So you got to keep that in mind, is that when we bring in a displacement map, right, and we load it in, it thinks the mid value is supposed to be 50% gray. But we're loading it, in this case, if we're plugging it straight into the Substance height channel, what it's doing is it's plugging that image into the height channel, which thinks that black is supposed to be in the mid value. So that means that our map, which is supposed to be flat right here, it's actually pushing the whole surface up even when it's supposed to be flat. So just know that they're working at different value ranges. So they're not really compatible out of the box. So that's why when I come into here and we do, let's go ahead and I'll bring the texture set list, and we're going to go ahead and unsolo that. So that's when we turn on that displacement. So we'll just go ahead and enable that displacement. That's why it's pushing that whole surface up out of, like the whole model's inflating, right? So there's 2 fixes that we could do this. First is we could add a levels adjustment. So you can come in here and add a levels adjustment. We can go to the height channel, and we can change its output from going to 0 to 1 and remap it to go from -1 to 1. And so you can see, because I'm pushing the displacement so far or so high, it's kind of pushing through the leather, and I probably just need to dial that displacement down, right? So I can dial that height down, or just like on here, I can, like I was doing before, I can just bring that displacement down. But for the most part, that mid value, the mid gray value, is going to stay still, and the white's going to push up and the black's going to push in, instead of in this case in my map, the black is staying still, and then everything's just pushing up. So we're just remapping our 0 to 1 image to go from -1 to 1 with the remap node, or sorry, not remap node, a levels node. Another approach that you can do, and this is kind of the one I tend to recommend to people, is instead of loading in your, let's go ahead and bring that up a little bit. So we'll just bring that up a bit. Instead of loading in your height channel, the displacement straight into the height channel, we'll just use the height as a mask. So the only downside to doing this is just going to push surfaces up, but it's going to give us a lot more control over it. And actually, the levels node, the getting that what I just showed with the levels node, it's probably a little bit more accurate, but just in terms of workflow, I tend to like doing this better. I lose a little information, but I kind of like doing this better. Is adding a paint layer. And, well, in this case, what we can do here, we'll do it this way. We'll duplicate this channel. So we'll duplicate the layer, or this layer. And instead of loading in the map there, I'm just going to actually just push the displacement. You can see the whole thing's inflating. And I'm going to go ahead and add a black mask, add a fill, and then I'll go ahead and add that displacement here. And then I'm just going to switch that tiling. I think it was something like 4 and 90 degrees to get the angle. Oops, put that in the wrong spot, 90. And then the nice thing about this is instead of doing an opacity change, I can just change the height value, right, to push it in and push it out, right? So I just kind of like doing that approach better. I think it tends to give me better results or more controllable results, but that's just a different approach. But like I said, the only downside is I'm just pushing the surface all up, and I'm using this as a mask to control where I'm pushing it out, in and out. But I do like doing this because I do like to be able to add filters and blurs and things like that. So I can add a filter, I can blur that just to loosen the detail. I could then use like a levels node if I want to clamp it or use sharpen. I could also do things like actually, let's leave this for now. So anyways, so that's just how I would be manipulating the displacement. Is the most accurate version you can get is to just take this and add a levels node to the height channel itself. So I'd go here and just remap that to go from 0 to 1, and we just change the opacity of this to pull it down. So we're just going to lower the values so it's a little bit darker. It's lower intensity. And if we look at this height channel, the problem is you can't really see height in very well inside of Substance Painter. It's kind of hard to look at that, but we're just going to be dialing this opacity down. So you can see before I put on the levels node, that midtone value is up here to gray, but now we're pulling it down to black by turning on this levels, and a lot of information we can't see because it's going below black. So here I've gone ahead and I like to do, paint layers with no information in them, but that I can use as a mask or anchor points. So I like to kind of have like this paint layer where I just, I'm loading in here. Let's go down to here. I'm loading in my displacement map. And then you can see that way I can do like adding some anchor points, and then I can make an adjustment to the image and add a different anchor point so I can get the same information but with slightly same map, but make some adjustments to it and get different anchor points that I can reference in. And you'll see on this height channel, we have I also loaded in this crevices mask. So I had this great color and roughness map. And so I just loaded in one of these cleaner maps so I can get those cavities or those cracks in, and I just I can disable those. I just loaded this in, and then I did like a little blur and levels just to kind of give me some control over the thickness and expansion of that, right? So I'm just blurring it. Blurring is just giving me softer shapes, and then the levels node, just using the levels node to grow and shrink that cavity. And up here, what I'm doing is I'm just loading the blurred version. So you can see I have a blurred and non-blurred version. So I've set an anchor point for my mask. So if we come down here, let's take a look at this guy. So I set an anchor point here, and then I blur it and set a levels and set another anchor point up here. And we'll call this one blur. Let's do that. Let's do blur anchor, and this one's going to be called normal anchor. So that way I can have both a blurred version of my image and a non-blurred version of my image, and so I'm using it up here, right? So I load that blur version in. You can see it gives me this big soft shape change, and then I went ahead and just enhanced the details a little bit by loading in with a multiply node. You can see here, and if I set this to normal, you can see it looks like that. I'm multiplying down the sharp version, so this is using that normal anchor. And here's a blur anchor, and so I'm just using this as multiply to kind of cut in sharper shapes into that big soft blur. And so that just gives me a little bit more crispness. And you can see on this one right here, instead I'm using the crevices mask. So you can see I use the crevices, and if we take a look at that, let's turn that one off for a second. That has that levels and blur node, so I can grow and shrink things. So it just gives me more control. So I like to have that kind of control to really change and adjust the information however I see fit. So that's why I like to load things into masks, and that's also why I like to use anchor points and layer stuff like that. But we're going to go and load that one up here. Something I also wanted to show was, so one thing I did want to also show here is, while I'm here, is this student was using this, it's a really cool map, and it's great kind of source image. But the problem was I don't have a reference pulled up. Her reference was these were very flat, right? Like these weren't so puffy and wrinkly. It was like a very stretched and pressed crocodile pattern. So something I was showing for hers is you could use something like a clamp node to clamp that stuff down, and maybe we can just dial back the intensity so it doesn't just completely polish it, right? So it's still a little organic, but just doing that really helped kind of make that feel a little bit more flat and like it was pressed and stretched instead of just like a raw crocodile skin. So that's something else I wanted to show while I was here. I'm just using a clamp node and just dialed that back. So the other thing I kind of wanted to show was, I'm going to turn this off, is this wrinkle painting. So something that's great is, you guys can use, maps for this kind of stuff, right? So I'll just go ahead and disable this for a second. So here you can see I'm starting to paint this stuff in. But you can load in maps, and you can load in stencils. Like ZBrush has, like you can go find ZBrush packs that have black and white images, and you can use them as stamps, right? You can like start stamping little shapes. In this case, I'm using this big broad cloth folds image, and I can probably just add a filter blur. So just add a little blur to it, so if those shapes are a little too sharp, right? So you could do that, but it's a little, the only problem with this is it's nice for like a big soft leather, but it's like a little not really obeying or paying attention to the surface. I would imagine this right here, this shape right here, or these little metal bits, they're going to be stretching or manipulating the folds more so than just a flat surface. So there might be a little bit more context around these areas, or even this leather kind of squeezing into this other leather. So you can use maps, right? Like you can use stencils and stamps, and you can just stamp on some like wrinkles stuff. But what I did here was I just set up just this. Let's go ahead and turn off that for now. I just set up this with a little bit of height. I'm using displacement to see this a little bit better, because it's not going to really show up very well if it's just height. So I'm using displacement, just turning in here. I'm using the height channel, but just doing displacement, set up the subdivision so I can see that a little bit better. But then what I did was first I set up a little paint layer. So I just went ahead and set up a paint layer. You can see I started painting these shapes here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and delete that paint layer, and we'll start a new. So I'll add a paint layer. I'm going to go ahead, come here. Let's get rid of that. Let's go ahead, and I'm just going to do soft. That was weird. Let's go basic soft, and I'm just going to go to a low flow so I can build that up. This might go really slow on your computer. So if your computer is a bit slow, you might want to, this might not be something that's very feasible to do real time. I'm going to do this down here, right around here. So what I was doing was I was just kind of painting in, let's do white. Ooh. So you can see that's going really slow. I might actually, I'm going to bring back this ambient occlusion. Sorry, I deleted the ambient occlusion for now just because it was a little distracting for me, but I'm going to solo this. Oh no, I've caused a problem. Ambient occlusion, this is loading in something else. Let's see. Ambient, maybe it's this one, hopefully. Nope. Let's see, ambient occlusion. I disconnected it and now I'm regretting it because there we go. Okay, so I can kind of see that shadowing. I turned off the other one so I can, they're kind of slowing it down a bit, but let's go back over here, and that flow is a little too big. And I'm going to turn off pin pressure for size, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of paint that, right? And I could get like a little bit smaller, right? Like if I wanted to do some like corner wrinkles and things like that. And, I want to separate these into different, I'm doing this all in one paint layer, but, I can even separate them. And then I can use black to subtract back out if I want to get like a sharper shape, right? And we're going to blur it in a second, right? Because this doesn't look very realistic, but, if I put this black next to white, then, I'm going to get like a sharper shape. And if I wanted to push in, right, I'd have to do a different, some kind of different setup, but let's not worry about that right now. So just going to go and do that. Let's push this up a bit. I don't know. I'm just painting. Okay, and so then what we could do is we can do some blurring. So you can see, in this case, I was doing it up here, but it's not going to work down here, but I can add a filter. So let's just go ahead and add a filter, and we're going to add a blur. And so we can just blur that down to the point where it feels like a little bit more organic, right? And so these could give me some like big soft shapes. And if I bring back the other stuff, right? Let's turn that off, right? So the idea is that this is like wrinkling around those areas. But I can come back in here. Let's turn that texture set off so I can go a little faster. What I was also doing was, especially if it's slower, let's come over here. I'm going to I'll disable that blur. I'll add another paint layer. So we'll add paint. And so I was doing like these big shapes right here. Like I was just kind of pushing it like this, and I was actually just pretty much just painting right here. And I was just doing these really big shapes, subtracting out, increase that flow, right? Just make this like really kind of scrungy and gross, and just get out that, a little bit of that. Probably wouldn't have quite as much folding on that curve, right? This edge right here, this exposed edge, probably won't have quite as much. So it's a little messy, but what's cool is I could use something like blur directional, right? So I have this blur directional, and so that blur directional is going to kind of blur it like horizontally. So if I had some horizontal folds, that's great. Obviously, if I turn it like this, it's going to go vertical. It's not quite what I was going for, but I could do that, right? So even if I'm getting a little messy, and the cool thing again is I can come back here and I can just, kind of erase and add shapes, and just use that flow to build it up more slowly if you want to. So I'll just kind of build that down, maybe build that up a bit, so something like that. And pay attention to your folds and cloth shapes, right? Make sure that it kind of matches the shape that you want from the material, right? Like we don't want to just add folds that don't make sense for the material, right? Like a really thin fabric t-shirt is going to get a lot of really wrinkly folds, right? Like really intense folds, right? So it might be something like a little bit more intense and sharp, but then something like a really big hard canvas material is probably not going to have such like small shapes, so it might have some bigger folds. So just pay attention to what you got, and then you can do something like maybe blur slope could give you like more of like a crinkly effect. So if you have like almost like a paper material, so I've seen some people have like really thin leathers that get kind of sharp edged and jagged, you could do something like a blur slope. And so what I just did was, maybe this is too much, but I just added blur slope. I just changed the source tiling a bit. I also added a little bit of a blur, so it's like a softer shape, because without the blur it's like really craggy. So you just add that. That just adds like almost like a wrinkly shape. And then just playing around with that intensity to have it softer or harder. And I'm using like the default noise, but what we could do is we could even make our own. Let's go ahead and I'm going to add another paint layer. So we're going to call this one, I'll call this one blur slope mask. And so we're just going to add a black mask to it. So we'll add a black mask, add a fill. So we'll just add a fill node. This is getting a little complicated, but and then we'll add a paint layer. But on this fill node, let's go ahead and load in a noise, because by default, the warp and blur slope are just going to add noise. So let's just do noise. Let's do something different, a little bit more interesting. So we'll do like black and white spots. And we'll add an anchor point. So let's just add an anchor point. This is going to be that blur slope mask. It's called blur slope anchor. And so we're in that blur slope node. So let's go ahead and bring that intensity up. And I'm going to go ahead and we'll do custom noise. And we'll go ahead and load in that anchor point as that custom noise. And then what I can do is I can come in here and I can just change the size of this, right, to adjust that, right? If I want it to be really small detail or really large detail, I can change the balance to have it like more frequent or less frequent, like, right? So if I have that balance up, right, it's going to be a little bit more frequent in some areas. Same thing going the other way, because it's just basing off of that contrast. So I'm just using my own custom noise to feed in that. So that's just something cool you can do if you want to. And then we can use the paint to like remove and increase information. So if I come in here, let's increase that right there. So if I think I probably want to do black or white, I can't remember. So you can see, something I should probably do up here, let's Control Z that, is up here now I'm loading my custom noise. So let's do blur slope. I'm going to change that source tiling to, I know, set that to 1. There you go. So then down here, I'll just manually change the tiling. So we'll get some bigger shapes. And I might, I should alt click on this to see what that looks like. So I come in here and that's that paint I just added. I think should be adding it. Nope. Okay. Let's get this black and white spots. Let's do tiling. There we go. So let's go back up here. Let's get that blur slope. Let's bring the intensity down a bit. There we go. And then I can come back down here to that blur slope mask, and we'll go paint if I want to, get rid of that. Let's go ahead and bring that flow down. If I want to get rid of that in some areas, and bring it back. So it's really the contrast though. So if there's no contrast, if it's whether it's black or it's white, right? It is going to do a little bit of blur slope, but it's not going to, you're not going to see like the hard crunchy details. So I just come in here and I can press 2 on my keyboard to bring my eraser, bring that in, and then I can just, go ahead and paint that back in with the eraser from that paint layer. So it's just revealing the layer below. And then just press 1 and then go back in to paint it. So a lot of really cool things you can do. It gets a little complicated, so be careful. Don't be too worried if this starts to get a little overwhelming. But just wanted to show that as like a neat way that you guys can paint in custom like wrinkles.